Thank you everybody for joining us today for our guest panel, our Decoding DEI, a how-to conversation for conscious job seekers. We're pleasantly blessed to have 4 guest speakers with us today who are going to share all of their professional information and wisdom with our listeners. So we'll go ahead and start with our introductions, and then we'll go ahead and do a deep dive into our questions for all of our listeners. So why don't we start with Tekeia? Why don't you introduce yourself and we'll go from there.
Hello, my name is Tekeia Howard. I am the Associate Director for Diversity Initiatives and On-Demand Career Advising at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. I'm very happy to be with you today.
Thank you. All right, let's go with Priscilla.
Hello, my name is Priscilla Mwamba. I'm a Westminster graduate, and I'm currently working as a diversity recruiter for Missouri Department of Corrections.
Thank you, and let's go with Tiffany next.
Hi everyone, my name is Tiffany White, and I am the owner of T&W Consulting, which is a career development consulting firm. And I spent 18 years at the largest bank in the United States, which is JP Morgan Chase, and primarily within the recruiting space.
Awesome, thank you. And Alessandra.
Hey everyone, my name is Alexandra Grieber. I am also a Westminster graduate. I graduated in 2011. And I am a financial advisor with Edward Jones. And I have been with Edward Jones for nearly 10 years now, ever since I graduated.
Okay, perfect. Thank you all again for joining us. So let's just go ahead and start with our questions here for any of our panelists. How would you define DEI?
So I will start and we can do it step by step. So, I will do that and then we can build off of it perhaps. So of course, diversity at its core is difference, the presence of difference. Equity comes with the understanding that everyone doesn't start at the same place. Don't start at the same place, I'm sorry. So it's about developing, striving for equitable, fair, impartial access and experiences. And inclusion is a feeling that people have, do they belong in this space? Not only are they there, the diversity piece, but their thoughts, their ideas, the collaborative effort is present in the space.
Okay, perfect. Does anybody else want to make any additions to that?
Yes, I would just add that many companies are looking to really diversify their workforce because they want the workforce to be indicative of their clients. And so it's very important that they have a variety of different types of individuals, different backgrounds, ethnicities, because they all bring something unique to the organization.
And to build off of that, many organizations actually have requirements within the hiring process that they require a certain number of diverse applicants, qualified applicants who they'd be willing to offer the job to before they're even allowed to offer a job. So that way they're doing their due diligence and not making any assumptions. They're not making there's no preconceived notions of who's going to get the job right away, that they're really looking for that they're thoroughly looking for a group of candidates.
So since this whole panel is geared towards career services and helping our students with the job search before and after, how can students identify legitimate, inclusive companies from the beginning to the end of the job search? And what are healthy signs that a company is practicing DEI?
One of the ways students can be able to tell whether the company is, practicing that is going to their website and also reaching out to the people who already work there and asking them about how they feel about working for that company, whether they feel that diversity, equity, and inclusion is part of the company philosophy.
And then I would also add, during the interview process, you can ask a company what are some of the specific things that they're doing from a diversity perspective, and they can tell you, their involvement in a, respective community or events that they've done, how employees can get involved in that process. So that's an important piece, I think, of, the interview process. And as Priscilla also mentioned, the website, because the companies want to showcase all the great work that they're doing. So you could start, with the website, but then also delve a little bit deeper as you're having phone and/or video interviews with the employers.
Okay.
And I would say a question to ask in an interview. I love that. Of interviewers like to get questions. They like to know you're engaged. So a great question is, what groups do you have that focus on DEI, that focus on your development and focus on that integration and inclusion?
Okay.
And then I
To
would
add
just,
maybe a
Michelle, too. Oh, I was just going to add real quick, and the verbiage is different too, depending on the company. So, some companies refer to them as the BRGs or, the employee networking group. So they have different names. Normally the functions are somewhat similar. But Alessandra, I think that's a great point, is to ask about those groups. Sometimes you meet individuals from those groups during the recruiting process because they're leveraging them, or they may even have them call you to talk a little bit. I've had students ask me about specific groups. So let's say if they fell into the LGBTQ environment, they would say, oh, well, do you have a pride group? I said, oh yeah, let me connect you with a couple of people in that group that can kind of talk you through the focus of the group and how you may be involved or can get involved as an intern or as a full-time hire.
Okay, perfect. For those students who are on the call here, I did attach a diversity program resource link document. Mandy can post that later on if we have any questions from anybody on here, but at the very bottom of the resource link document, I do have 5 to 6 questions that students can ask their employers to make sure that they do have those initiatives in place, if that is important to the student. What questions besides, what are some questions you guys have for a student to ask during an interview to explore those initiatives or current policies that we may have missed in our list? And I can share that too.
And I would like to add a few more resources to evaluating organizations around their diversity efforts. I would definitely suggest something called Diversity Inc. And that website is very broad and thorough, I will say. It will show you, they have their top 50. It will show you which companies support women, international, queer community, you name it. They have identified these top 50 organizations, and they do it every year, right? There's also something called Affirmity. And Affirmity is where people who actually work in that environment tell you what it's like. So you get to try it on with someone else's clothes on, really. And it's like unedited, frank, honest conversation and feedback. That's then I also want to share, look on LinkedIn. What are their employers posting? What are they saying? IG, Facebook, like look for ways, because they're looking at you the same way, right? They're not only looking at your resume, they're also checking out on LinkedIn and Facebook. So look at all these spaces, right? Because you could have one really great diversity program and it's in February and that's it. But you're going to work there for 12 months if all goes well. So look at the big picture and the small picture. And yes, lean in and ask those conversations, ask those really important conversations that are important to you, either to confirm what you perceive is true or to ask questions you haven't seen yet. One of my favorite questions I like to ask is, who's on your executive committee? How did they get there? And tell me about their experience. And your leadership, executive committee, leadership, boards, whatever the case may be. Because also, we like to say that we aren't only preparing students for their first job, we're preparing for your lifelong career journey. So you want to know there's someone there who has a similar interest that can support you on your journey. So if you don't see anyone in executive leadership, ask, what opportunities do you have? What training programs do you have for women in this industry? Especially if you have the content because you've done the research around women in engineering. I'm trying to think of, or whatever it may be. And ask that question. Look how people dress. Is it conservative or is it not? Can I wear tattoos? Can I not? Whatever. I don't know. Do they have several piercings? Is it not? And then, but then I will say, and then ask the question. Because there are a lot of pretty pictures out there, but then ask the question about the reality of day to day. So that, again, my favorite question is, how does your leadership team look? And what strategies do you have to increase or continue or to increase diversity holistically in these organizations?
Tekeia, I have a question. The Diversity Inc. you're talking about, is it, does it also include the 50 companies in rural areas, or just the big, because some students might come from a rural area where the company might not be included on that. I just wanted to say that.
So with Diversity Inc., it is self-report. So employees organizations say, I want to submit, and then there's a big statistical analysis, then they promote. And I think if the company is not there that you're interested in, I think the points they're graded on, right, are listed out. So then you can kind of say, well, in this case, in finance, these are really popular for this. I wonder how it is for the smaller finance company, and then ask that question. So you're right, it is self-report, but it still has some language around there and for what industry trends are.
And then I would just add to be mindful of the source of the information, because many companies pay to be put into different publications, magazines. And so it may appear that they're doing all of these things, but that may not necessarily be the case. I think like Diversity Inc., I actually subscribe to that. So I get their emails and the information is relevant and I trust that information, but you have to be mindful of the source. The other thing I want to add too is just because you don't see much about an organization doesn't mean that they're not doing anything, because many organizations have policies. So when I was at JP Morgan Chase, we could not put feedback about those types of things on social media and various avenues. There were certain policies around that. So it didn't necessarily mean that we weren't doing it. It was more of a regulated process in terms of how we communicated that information. So just wanted to throw that out there.
That's exactly how it is with the state. Working for the state government, there's so much rules and regulations. So sometimes when you go to a government agency here in the state of Missouri, you might not see the information you are expecting. But if you reach out to the people who work there, you'll be able to find out a lot more.
Another one to look out for that's a very good company is called HRC, which is the Human Rights Campaign. Their logo is blue with an equal sign that's yellow. It's geared towards the LGBT community. And look out for what a company's rating is on that. If you go to their website, that'll actually tell you what does 100% rating mean on the corporate index score. How do companies get involved with that? How do they get rated? What are those ratings? So to some of the points made earlier, if a company doesn't have an HRC rating, it's not a bad thing, but it does give you what are some questions to ask of what those ratings come from to dig in a little deeper for those companies.
And I love that all of you have mentioned it's great for the students to ask questions ahead of time. How many questions are too many to ask of an employer to where you're drilling the employer? I usually tell my students between 4 to 6 questions, but they will have other questions besides these initiatives like work-life balance, goals of the company, and so on and so forth. So how many questions would you recommend a student ask an employer?
I would say try to read the room where you are. If you're in an interview room and look at the panelists, and you'll be able to tell whether you can freely ask more questions or not. So prepare as many questions as you can, but depending on the mood of the room, you'll be able to decide how many questions you think will be good enough. I don't think you should put a limit on how many questions you should ask, but once you are there and you've examined to see what's going on, you should be able to read the room to see what works.
And then I would add, it kind of depends on the situation. So for instance, I would have students that would reach out to me on LinkedIn just to have kind of an informational session. So we'd schedule 30 minutes. So they knew that they had that amount of time to ask me all the questions that they had. During an interview, normally interviewers will reserve a certain amount of time on the schedule for questions. So let's say hypothetically 30-minute interview, we may save, maybe 8 to 10 minutes or, 5 to 7 minutes for questions. So be mindful, be mindful of the time and not pushy, because we've had some students, like we were actually at the end and trying to wrap up, but some students still were kind of pushing their questions versus saying, you know what, I do have some additional questions. Can I follow up with you at a later time or something like that? So to Priscilla's point, you definitely have to read the situation and the time constraints that you're in. But we love questions. We prefer that versus I've interviewed thousands of people that have had no questions. So not one question to ask. So, we'd rather you have questions. It's great if the questions are meaningful and it shows us that you've done your research versus something that maybe you just read in the book that's kind of more of a peripheral type question. So we can kind of read through those and tell, okay, is this person really interested? Have they really done their research? Have they incorporated information from conversations that they've had with employees, things of that nature?
Perfect.
I would just add one thing about know who you're interviewing with. So the questions you ask recruiters are a little bit different than you would ask your hiring manager or peers. So that's another piece. When you someone extends you an offer to interview, say, great, can you tell me who I'm interviewing with? So as a recruiter, you're asking probably more, scope of the day, typically some basic roles and responsibilities. You're hiring manager, you want to know, them as a human as well. So maybe a little more personal questions, but very intentional about the day, what are their expectations, what success is like in this role. Then of course, your peers, now we get into how was your experience if it's about around diversity as a woman in this space? How is diversity celebrated, from your perspective? So I think it's about your audience and maybe 2 or 3 questions per audience, perhaps, reading the room and understanding the relationship, the role that you're interviewing for.
I would also say, don't feel the need to ask questions just to ask questions. So Tiffany kind of hit on this. If you're being interviewed by somebody, let's say it is a smaller company, the person interviewing you, they know you. They know a lot about maybe the job or the company. Maybe you're in a company already and you're interviewing for a new position within the same company. It's okay that if you don't have questions as well, if you're already very well versed, maybe you've already talked to the interviewer several times before this. So know that too, that it's okay not to have questions. Again, read the room, know kind of your relationship with who's interviewing you.
So moving along with some additional questions here, when should a student disclose that they have a disability, or should they even disclose their disability at all?
That should depend on the disability. Some of the disability needs to be accommodated during the interview. So if they don't know about that, they wouldn't be able to accommodate you properly to conduct the interview. So.
And I would just, say, ultimately it's up to the individual, but there are instances where that information is very valuable because in some cases there may be specific initiatives for individuals that fall within that realm. And so it's helpful to know because, that organization may want to, invite those students to participate in a info session or some type of process. So if we don't know, then we're not able to decide what could be the best fit, for the candidate.
It can also be really helpful if you know that you're going to have to take some tests or something, depending on your disability.
Right.
In finance, you're required legally to get licenses. Now, when you're in the licensing process, there are questions that come from regulators of, do you need, ADA accommodations? What, is there something going on? But that's really beneficial for an employer to know too, if you need certain accommodations during a study process, because they're gonna be flexible with you if they know. Again, if they don't know, it makes it really hard for them to be mindful of that and to be flexible in the ways that you need. So I would say also with disclosing it, know what certain requirements or work environment you're going into.
What is your advice on how students should respond to interview questions that are red flags or even illegal when referencing maybe a disability or a sexual orientation, anything that are red flags? What is your advice on how they should handle?
I have a thought, but I am not a professional interviewer, so I'm going to let a couple of others answer that first.
I would say be yourself. If you find some question offensive, just you have the right not to answer that question. You tell them that I cannot answer that because I don't feel right to answer that question.
I would echo that. I would deflect depending upon where you are in your life, because some folks and their need to have this job made is relevant, right? So I think, but deflecting is really important. That sometimes sounds like, wow, that's an interesting question, but let me tell you why I'm qualified for this position. Or, I'm uncertain about that response. I'm uncertain about what your questions are getting at, but, for this role, I have this, I have that, and I am ready to work, and I think I'll be excellent in this position. So deflect, and if you feel pressure for whatever reason, it may be advantageous to say, wow, that question feels a little bit uneasy for me, feels uncomfortable for me. I prefer not to answer that right now. And then, as calmly as you can, then move on to the next phase, or if you have a question, then ask a question.
And then I would add too, as companies, it is their responsibility to make sure all of the interviewers are trained. And so, does that happen everywhere? Maybe, maybe not. But from a company perspective, interviewers are supposed to be trained in terms of what are the legal questions that you can ask, what you cannot ask. If you have an interview that's uncomfortable, I highly recommend you letting your career services team know so that they can follow up with the company, because many times it could be, let's say hypothetically, a banker or someone that's not in HR that they thought they knew the type of questions they should ask, or they missed the training session or whatever. So it's, I think it's important to let your career services know, because if there tends to be a trend with a particular company, that's something that career services can deal with. And I know that can be very challenging being put in that situation, but I like, the suggestions from Tekeia, Priscilla, Alessandra, in terms of, deflect and just say, I'm not comfortable answering that question, questions related to age, or as you mentioned, sexual orientation, things of that nature. Those, should be off the table and not a factor for why somebody would be, a good fit for a position.
And I would say too, there are definitely questions that are illegal to ask in an interview. And to Tiffany's point, maybe they're not aware of that. A good deflection is, tell me a little bit more about why that's important for this role. Mm-hmm. Maybe they are looking for someone who falls into the LGBT community. Maybe they are looking for someone and they're trying to dig a little deeper. Again, some of those questions are not legal to ask, but it's kind of presenting yourself in, giving them the benefit of the doubt. And it also helps you as the person who's being interviewed remain more calm. And that way you don't get as flustered of, why are they asking me this? Why does this matter? This shouldn't even be asked. It can really help with your mindset in the interview itself of, tell me a little bit more about why that's important for this role. And then I love the other points of, here are my qualifications. Here's why I am good for this role, and pulling it back around that way. But I find a lot of times that can help more your emotional state than anything whenever something like that happens.
I wonder if
Michelle, can I interrupt?
Sure.
Unless you have a follow-up question, where there's a question in the chat box. So when you're ready, I can share.
Okay. Well, it was kind of a follow-up to all four of the panelists. Is it ever okay, or would you recommend to a student, if they felt that uncomfortable, and say they come back, like Alessandra recommended and kind of reframe it and say, why is this question important to this role? And they are not happy with their answer. Is it ever okay for a student to say, I no longer feel comfortable in this interview? I think it's time for me to maybe cut this interview a bit short. Is it okay for them to do that? Or do you recommend them stay the course for the rest of the interview, knowing that you're going to be sitting in some uncomfortable, maybe heightened emotional feelings?
In my opinion, I would say if you're uncomfortable, you could cancel. I've actually been to an interview where I decided I was, it wasn't because I wasn't comfortable, but I asked them some questions about what the duties of the job was before the interview. I asked them if it will require travel, because I can travel. I'm a mother and I don't have too much time to be traveling to go like out of state or places like that, which requires overnight stay. So before the interview, I was like, oh, before we start the interview, I have a question. In your job post, you didn't list, the amount of travel time. Is there travel time on this? And they were like, oh yeah, you'll be gone for like 3 or 4 days a week. I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to sit for an interview, then I have to leave. So you have the right to, if you feel uncomfortable in an interview, you feel like it's not what you wanted, you can, at any point in time, you could tell them, like, thank you for your time, but I think I'm gonna end here. I don't think I'm interested in any more of the interview. And I think that's fine, as long as you're polite, you say it in a nice way without being rude and offensive to the panelists.
And I think when you do that, one of two things is going to happen. They're not even going to realize that they've done anything, and you're going to know that this is not a company you want to work for. Or B, they're going to realize that they crossed the line. They had zero intention of crossing a line. Maybe it was an unconscious bias, and they follow back up with you and work to make amends. And you find that they're working on things, and that was not intentional, and they want another opportunity. So one of two things is going to happen there. If you, like Priscilla said, you politely say, I'm not comfortable to continue.
Okay, perfect. Okay, Mandy, yeah, it looks like there's a question from one of our listeners here, Meg Langland, who is our former director of the Center for Career Development. She has a question for us. Are there federal initiatives to hire more people with disabilities?
I don't think there is federal mandate, but disabilities, just like the other protected classes, like minority, and they are protected, so nobody should discriminate against them. So if someone applies for a job and they're disabled, they can't be refused the job just because they're disabled. But there's no set mandate saying you need to hire X amount of disabled people. That's up to the company to decide how much disabled people they think they can accommodate in their workplace.
And I will add too that, maybe it depends on the industry and the company, but there are many firms that have to report like their affirmative action reports, because I've had to fill those out before. And so you do have to report the number of people that you've hired from various classes, because given the nature of the industry and that particular organization, there is reporting that you have to do. And, there obviously is more attention on the candidates with the disability, the African-American, the Hispanic, because in many companies, the numbers are lower in those spaces. And so the government wants to know, what are you doing from either a recruiting perspective or, to attract and hire these types of individuals. And so, you'd often have to fill out, annual reports in terms of what has your success been related to, various populations.
The only additional tool I would like to add to the conversation is each state has a disabilities. So I would encourage you to look at the state that you're seeking employment and see what they offer for support, guidelines, mentoring, counseling, et cetera, and jobs, right? And career or internship opportunities. So take the time and doing your research and your job search or internship search to look at what the state standards and resources are.
Thank you. So those were our pre-employment questions. Now let's move into the after-employment questions for students who find themselves already employed by a company. How can an entry-level employee advocate for themselves if they feel they've been discriminated against? Who or where do they go for support?
Depends on how you want to handle it. So I'll jump in here. Companies have their HR department, their employee assistants, employee relations or associate relations. Every company calls it a little something different. There should be a person you can go to that at the very least you can talk to. They can keep the information confidential. They're trained on how to handle maybe, you know, how to bring a joint conversation together, how to help you bring it up to, let's say it's another employee or a boss. They're also trained in the legal aspects too of was a legal line crossed in this as well. So they're going to be able to help you. Most companies have what's called a whistleblower line as well. So that's a line you can anonymously report information. So if it's you really just don't feel comfortable you being knowing that someone knows you're the one that reported something, most companies, to my knowledge, have an anonymous line that you can report information to as well. So it depends on how far you want to take it.
And normally as a new hire at many firms, there's training, you know, online training or some type of training related to those types of things. And even in that training, they will say, if you've experienced this, you know, this is the individual that you reach out to. So you have that information should you need, you know, to use it.
And with the state of Missouri, Department of Corrections, where I work, we have a clear line. CLEAR standing for confidential line for employee allegation and reporting. So that's a line we have, which is anonymous. You call and you report any discrimination, harassment, any unprofessional conduct against you, either by your supervisor or your coworker. You could call that, and we have our legal people work with that, and they don't reveal your identity. They work confidentially to resolve the issues. And when it comes to the DEI complaints, that they go through the same clear line, and then we work together with the human resources, the diversity group, to help resolve the issue.
Perfect.
But usually every company will train you on how to report when something happens. I think people need to remember to take advantage of that, because I feel like when you're a new hire, you're just new at the job, and sometimes they're afraid to speak up. But if you don't speak up in your first few weeks of working there and people start discriminating against you or harassing you, that can develop into a bigger problem later on, because people think that's acceptable. You're accepting that, and that's okay with you. So be mindful that if you experience any such issues at your workplace, report it before it becomes a bigger issue, and then you end up quitting instead of having them handle that problem before it leads you to quitting your job.
Another question, how can an employee create or advocate for DEI programming in the workplace? How can they get something going if an initiative or a BRG, business resource group, does not exist?
I would say that they can create a proposal. At one point, we did not have a group for young adults. And so a group of people got together. They were recent college grads and came up with a proposal. And so they presented it to HR. And so the group was formed from their ideas. So, I think, there's obviously synergism, having others working with you on it, and, sharing that information with your HR contact or your program manager and seeing what the options are to starting, a new group. The key thing is to do the research to make sure that the group doesn't already exist and maybe you just don't know about it. And to really come up with a solid proposal, because that's going to be the first question. Well, how do you envision this looking? And so putting something together shows you put thought into it. And, this is something that, you're showing your interest that, and other people are interested in it because you've talked with some of the other folks that have just joined, they're interested. And so that helps the overall case.
Because all of you in your first positions will have an awesome mentor in your space of company. It's great to have executive leadership or manager leadership to say, yes, I vouch, I support, and I'm going to be that co-signer on that proposal as well. So it's a holistic approach, especially if you have that support from above, wherever above is for you.
And that's a perfect segue to my next question. So how do you bring up diversity issues in daily workplace conversations like water cooler talk? How do you initially kind of break the ice conversationally with your coworkers?
One way that it always worked for us in a little bit more of a corporate environment in our headquarters. One, you knew we're big. Edward Jones is a big company, but so we have a lot of rankings. We have the BRGs, so they're called business resource groups. You kind of you knew who was on different ones that you could comfortably go and ask and talk to. But I also looked for the way people decorate their workspace. So for example, people that were part of our LGBT BRG, they had that HRC sticker on their cabinet or a magnet, or I would look for those kind of things of what are things that they have in their workspace that tell you they're an advocate for something, or they're part of a group. That can be a really great way to know ahead of time you're in a safe space to start to have some of those conversations.
I love that. Does anybody have anything else to add?
I would just, add just, by networking, within the firm, you normally can see, the employees throughout the organization. And a lot of times they'll have like a little bit about themselves, or even if you look at their LinkedIn, and, that's how you can also get to know people without necessarily coming out and say, oh, I see you're of this ethnicity and we may have some things in common. There's other ways that you can do it where it's not perceived in a threatening or negative manner.
I think this conversation begins in the interview. So if you're interviewing with your peers and it's hard for them to say LGBTQ, it's hard for them to say Black, that's a suggestion of culture, right? I mean, I've been interviewed like, I'm like, no, I don't, tell me more, right? So I think that you get an idea of what is the culture is like before you enter the workplace in the first day. And then I think I'm encouraging folks to consider as you're interviewing the interviewer about the culture is ask those questions, yes, and identify, is it a safe space? Because it's really important that you can be yourself in work. I mean, we spend most of our time in someone's work facility, right? Even though we're remote, we spend our time in these boxes, right? So it's important that you can be yourself and then interview your peers or talk to your peers and where is that safe space. But I really do think that it's important to start the conversation in the interview. So then you can have an idea of what does it mean for you to be in that space. But it's low hanging fruit from the rooms decorations to talking to someone at the water cooler. I couldn't imagine being in a workspace during the summer and not being able to talk about COVID and the disparities in that, or the racial reckoning, as some folk call it, or the racial tension and violence now, as recently as last month. I couldn't imagine not being able to say, oh my goodness, I'm heavy with this. And I'm here, but wow, this is really on my mind. So finding that space.
Awesome. If we've talked about the perspective from the employee side of the conversation, but what changes have each of you seen within organizations, since you've been employed in your field? I know we've seen a lot of change just in the last year. with Black Lives Matter events over the summer and, preceding that, but within your respective careers, what changes have you seen?
A big change that we've made is, one, I mentioned it at the beginning, there has to be a certain number of candidates of a diverse background before our managers or leaders are even allowed to make a hiring decision and make an offer. Other things that seem small but are really big, we changed a lot of our health insurance language. So you now have primary caregiver leave and secondary caregiver leave to both accommodate for families who maybe the mom doesn't get very good leave and dad takes primary caregiver leave instead of maternity and paternity. It also appeals to those families of the same-sex household, same-sex marriage. It's not maternity and paternity then. So we changed it to that language. We also have in our health insurance that there's a transgender change that's covered by our health insurance. And so things like that have been changes that the company has advocated for with our benefits planning that really help appeal to different groups of people, that those are benefits that are really important. So those are just a couple on our end.
And then I've seen companies hold hiring managers more accountable for their hiring. So for instance, their scorecard for performance may have diversity on there. And so they're looking at, okay, out of the people that you've hired on your team, how many of those individuals were diverse? So holding the hiring managers more accountable as well for making sure that the organization is bringing in the diverse talent. So it's training around that. So how do I think differently as a hiring manager? It may be my first inclination to hire somebody that looks like me, who we have all these things in common, versus looking at a broader pool of candidates that I may not be as familiar with their experience or the school that they attended, but these are qualified candidates as well. So it's, more work around the hiring process, and not, in the past it was heavy recruiter. So recruiter, you're responsible for A, B, and C. But, as a recruiter, we normally do the initial screen, but the hiring managers in most cases are the ones that actually, do the hiring. And so it's really training them and holding them more accountable for the results of their teams. And, I think that makes a difference too. Having hiring managers nominate people to participate in the recruiting process. Maybe individuals that on their team, they're focused on making sure the team is hiring diverse people. Do we have a diverse slate of candidates when we recruit at Westminster? What can we do more of on campus? One of the things that when I was at the bank, we instituted a diversity champion. So each school team had a diversity champion, and that person was responsible for making sure, if we're at Miami of Ohio, that we've connected, with the diverse organizations, that we have a diverse slate of candidates on our interview schedule, things of that nature. So I've seen a lot more work around that lately than, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago.
And with Department of Corrections, I've seen quite a lot of change in the areas of diversity. I just found out, I didn't know, I had to look it up before this. This question helped me learn. And I actually found out we have about 50% of our probation and parole administrators, regional administrators, are minority women. And we have a lot more leadership roles taken up by women and minority people. So that's something I've really seen a big difference from, when I started working with Department of Corrections. And also the department is doing a statewide initiative in we're calling it EDBI, equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, all that together. And we're doing a research with the University of St. Louis, trying to get an understanding of how our employees perceive the issues of DEI within our workforce. And with that, the department is prepared to make changes based on what their research reveals. It's not complete yet, but it's in progress. And that's something uplifting from my perspective, to see that, my workplace is interested in its, minority well-being by asking such questions and coming up with such initiatives. So yeah, that's what we're doing. On the statewide level, we have the Office of Equal Opportunity Employment, and they advocate and try to come up with programs which the rest of state agencies can adopt and try to use in their efforts to help with the diversity and inclusion aspects.
Perfect.
So, I work in higher ed, so I can tell you what employers say, right? So my colleagues probably can identify with this. And so I have a word of encouragement that now, like no other time in the past, people, employers are saying, who are you and how can we work together? Like no other time, people are saying, wow, we want to celebrate your diversity and welcome your diversity and respect your diversity. Please let us know who you are in an authentic, holistic way. So I think, be it recruiters or hiring managers, or maybe CEOs, are really taking a look at who is in the space and how can we allow them, give them permission to be the best version of themselves. So that has been a very change in conversation we talk to employers, and I think very empowering for students. I think students have been a little bit more empowered to talk about, Spectrum or the Black Student Union in very career leadership ways. So that's a change I have seen from a different non-employer perspective or recruiter organization wise.
And I would say the best advice I ever received from when it comes to that interviewing is be yourself. Bring your true self forward in the interview. Let them see you smile. Let them see you laugh. Let them see that emotion and that your energy and your personality. I remember interviewing for a job several years ago when I was practicing with someone, and she is like, "You are boring, and you're not a boring person." Like, she goes, "Relax. Let your personality show through." And so that all starts in that interview process too, as to how well they welcome that diversity and inclusion. Because if they see that of you in the interview, they're looking for someone with your energy, your personality, and whatever else comes with that you're going to bring to the table.
I think all of that is great advice.
Something else I wanted to add. Also have a positive mindset when you go to the interview. Because if you go into the interview room with your mindset thinking, oh, they're going to discriminate against me, or maybe they're going to do this, then as all the questions they'll be asking you, your mind will interpret them as being in the negative way. So if you go with a positive mindset and you're going to show them the best side of you and show that to them without having any negative thoughts prior to the interview, you'll be able to do well.
And then I would just add, be consistent. So with everyone that you talk to, be consistent, because I would talk with some students and they were fantastic with me. We connected, we had a great interview. They meet with the hiring manager. It was like it was a different person, right? Because I guess we had this connection, perhaps we were the same ethnicity, had some things in common, and then they meet with the hiring manager. It's a totally different experience. They're not as outgoing as they were with me. They thought they had to be more stoic and not really show their personality, to Alessandra's point. So it's important that whether you're meeting with the recruiter, the hiring manager, feel comfortable being yourself, showing your personality. It's okay to smile and, not act like, okay, I have to be so conservative and stiff. And, be mindful about what you say. So if someone says, how are you doing today? Don't say, oh, I've had a long day. I'm tired. Like, people have told me that before. Well, you're supposed to be excited regardless of what happened before you met with me. You should be doing fantastic. When I ask you, even if you're not feeling that way, at least tell me that and show me that during the interview, because there's so much competition. There's no room for error. companies are interviewing thousands of people for these internships and these full-time roles. So that is your one shot to do the best job that you can. And those mock interviews are helpful. So that's something I would always stress with my students when I was teaching at DePaul, was do mock interviews with career services, do it with your friends, family, practice. There's online systems such as Interview Stream even, where you can do an interview, record yourself and see how you do in that interview, see how your impressions are, your gestures, things of that nature. So practice, practice, practice is really the key.
And that's not just for the first interview that you ever get into a company. The last interview I talked about, that was a role I applied for 8 years into the company. And so it's not just the first time, it's every time you practice and you get better and better each time. You learn to become more yourself as well. And then you're not as nervous.
I love all this advice, and I know we're wrapping up the time here, and I want to be mindful of the hour because everybody has classes and other meetings. What would be your final piece of advice from each of you to our listeners that they can glean from this entire conversation? Just last pieces of advice.
I would say put yourself out there. Apply to as many places as you can. Don't be afraid to ask questions in the interview. And if you are an international student, don't be afraid to, to apply, because you don't know. We know now that most companies are looking for diverse individuals. So with that, as an international student, you have an advantage because more people want to have you there. It helps the workplace to be, entertaining, and not just entertaining, but we all have different ideas of resolving issues, and that helps knowing that, how other people resolve the same issue you might have. So apply to as many places as you can. When you go to the interview, be positive and confident in yourself, in your abilities, and showcase that to them.
And I would say the biggest thing is don't limit yourself. Don't get in your head on, oh, I think this company is too big for me, or I don't think that they're going to hire me, or whatever that might be. I have a lot of people who are like, holy cow, how did you get into Edward Jones? That's a company of 50,000 employees across the United States and Canada. It's one of the biggest financial firms in the country. How did you do that? Like, I don't know, I applied for an internship in college because they didn't require a cover letter. And that's the truth. And now I am a partner with the company. I became a partner at 26. And so you never know what can happen and where something can take you. So don't get in your head and limit yourself on maybe I don't know enough about that company, or I don't know what I want to do. Just apply and good things will come from it.
Okay.
And then I would say start your job search out on a positive note. So start out knowing that you will get that internship or that full-time opportunity. If you start defeated, that's what your results will be. So it's important that you have a positive attitude. It's important that you see yourself in that dream job, whatever that is. It's important that you research various industries, various companies. It's important that you network. And then lastly, practice.
My final word is go to your career center early and often. They have all the information, talent, heart, hand, all of that I know for sure. And the services they provide, I know is unprecedented. And here's another secret. Once you leave this institution, the amount you have to pay to get that amount of care and attention is significant. So lean in and go to your career center early and often. That would be my advice.
Thank you.
Something else. One last. Well, don't limit yourself. I know everybody has these dream jobs they want to have, but also have a backup plan, because not everybody gets their dream job after college. So with that, that's where it comes in, where you apply to as many places as possible. If you're applying with a state, especially the state of Missouri, don't be afraid starting low, because starting low will just get you the door into there, and then you can easily promote to something better than what you started from. So don't limit yourself because you see the starting salary is so low and like, I'm not gonna start that. I want to start with 60,000 a year. That's possible, but to be realistic, most of us started at 20-something thousand and then transitioned and got to where we are through that way. So with the state of Missouri, within Department of Corrections, we have several opportunities. You could start low, and then you can climb up to however high you want to go.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody who would join us today, to our special guest panelists. We'll be posting this recording to our Student Success Center YouTube page. And yes, Mandy just posted our resource link that Tiffany and the others provided for us. We'll be posting that to our MyWC page, Student Success Center tab someplace. But thank you again, and everybody have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.